Somewhere inside a freezer aisle, on the back of an ice cream carton, there is a word most people pass over without stopping: locust bean gum. Sometimes it appears as E410, sometimes as carob gum. Sometimes it sits near other ingredients with names that sound technical, invisible, and far removed from anything that ever grew on a tree. But that small ingredient has a strange origin. It comes from the seed of the carob tree, a Mediterranean species that once fed people, animals, travelers, and entire rural communities long before chocolate became a global obsession. Most people think carob disappeared because it failed. They remember it as a strange brown powder from health food stores, sold as a substitute for chocolate, then rejected because it did not taste exactly like cacao. For many, carob became a joke, the disappointing chocolate that was never really chocolate. But that memory hides the more interesting truth. Carob did not disappear. Only part of it did. The seeds survived inside the modern food industry, ground and processed into a thickener that helps ice cream stay creamy, sauces hold together, dairy products stabilize, and processed foods keep the texture consumers expect. The industry kept the part that could be extracted, standardized, labeled, and sold quietly under a code. What disappeared from most people's imagination was the pod itself. The dark, leathery fruit, the sweet pulp, the roasted powder. The old Mediterranean food that did not need cacao, caffeine, or tropical forests to create something deep, brown, sweet, and almost chocolate-like in its own way. That is where the real story begins. Because carob was never supposed to be fake chocolate. It was a different plant, with a different history, a different chemistry, and a different relationship to the land. It grew on dry hillsides where more delicate crops struggled. It tolerated heat, poor soil, and long summers. It produced pods that could be dried, milled, boiled into syrup, fed to animals, or eaten by people who understood its value, without needing to compare it to anything else. Then the modern world made a mistake. It introduced carob to millions of people under the wrong promise. Instead of saying, "Here is an ancient Mediterranean pod with its own sweet roasted flavor," it said, "Here is chocolate without chocolate." That comparison almost guaranteed disappointment. Cacao is bitter, fatty, complex, and intense. It carries the chemistry of the tropics, the fermentation of its beans, and centuries of confectionery craft built around sugar, milk, roasting, and fat. Carob is naturally sweeter, lower in fat, caffeine-free, and softer in flavor. It leans toward caramel, dried fruit, toasted grain, and mild cocoa notes. But it does not strike the tongue with the same bitterness that makes chocolate feel powerful. So people tasted carob expecting chocolate, and carob lost the trial. Not because it had no value, but because it had been accused of being something it was never meant to be. Meanwhile, the global chocolate industry kept growing. Cacao became one of the most emotionally powerful flavors on Earth, tied to childhood, holidays, romance, comfort, and reward. Supermarkets filled with chocolate bars, chocolate cereals, chocolate drinks, chocolate spreads, and chocolate desserts. The flavor became so familiar that anything brown and sweet was judged by how closely it could imitate cacao. Carob had no chance inside that frame. But outside that frame, something different was happening. The same tree, dismissed as fake chocolate, kept appearing in ingredient lists under another identity. Its seeds became valuable because they contained a gum that food manufacturers could use. Its pods remained important in traditional regions, where people still made syrups, flours, drinks, and animal feed. And in dry Mediterranean landscapes, the tree kept doing what it had always done, surviving where water was limited, and producing food from land that could not easily support thirstier crops. Then, in the 21st century, the chocolate world began facing a problem that made carob look different. Cacao prices rose sharply. West African supply chains came under pressure from weather, disease, aging farms, and economic stress. Consumers began looking for caffeine-free alternatives, lower-fat ingredients, and crops that could handle a hotter, drier future. Suddenly, the failed substitute did not look like a failure anymore. It looked like a plant introduced too early, under the wrong name, to a world that was not yet ready to understand it. And if we want to understand why carob matters now, we have to begin where the old mistake began. Not with the seed hidden inside E410, but with the pod that people once knew how to use. Because before carob became a disappointing imitation of chocolate, it was something far older and more interesting. It was food. For thousands of years, carob belonged to a very different food world than the one that eventually judged it against chocolate. It grew around the Mediterranean basin, in landscapes shaped by dry summers, rocky hillsides, and long periods without rain. In those regions, a useful tree was not always the one that produced the richest flavor or the most delicate fruit. Often, the most valuable tree was the one that survived when other crops struggled. Carob fit that world perfectly. Its branches carried long, dark pods that looked almost too hard to be food at first glance. They were leathery on the outside, curved like old pieces of wood, and filled with a dense pulp surrounding small, hard seeds. But when the pods matured and dried, their pulp became naturally sweet, rich with sugars that made the fruit valuable in places where refined sweeteners were once rare or expensive. People learned to use carob in practical ways. The pods could be chewed by travelers. They could be ground into flour. They could be boiled down into syrup. They could be mixed into drinks, baked into sweets, or fed to animals during seasons when other forage was limited. In some regions, carob became part of everyday survival rather than a luxury food, because it could produce nourishment from dry land with very little attention once the tree was established. That is the first important difference between carob and cacao. Cacao is a tropical crop. It belongs to humid regions, shaded plantations, fermentation boxes, and a long chain of processing before it becomes chocolate. Carob belongs to dryland orchards, sun-baked hillsides, and pods that can be harvested, dried, roasted, and milled with far less complexity. This does not make carob superior. It makes it different. And that difference is exactly what modern marketing failed to respect. Carob pulp contains its own sweetness, mostly from natural sugars in the pod. It also contains dietary fiber, minerals, and plant compounds that have made it interesting to food scientists and traditional cooks alike. Unlike cacao, it does not contain caffeine or theobromine, which means it can produce a dark, roasted, dessert-like flavor without the stimulant chemistry that some people try to avoid. That fact alone could have made carob valuable on its own terms. It could have been introduced as a caffeine-free roasted pod flour, a Mediterranean sweetener, a dryland crop, or a traditional ingredient with a flavor somewhere between cocoa, caramel, dried fruit, and toasted grain. Instead, in many modern markets, it was introduced as chocolate's replacement. That single decision changed its reputation, because the moment carob was called chocolate without chocolate, people stopped tasting what it was and began measuring what it lacked. They looked for cacao bitterness, cacao fat, cacao aroma, and the familiar emotional richness of a chocolate bar. When carob did not deliver those exact sensations, the conclusion came quickly. It was fake. But this was never a fair test. A fig does not fail because it is not a grape. Honey does not fail because it is not cane sugar. Coffee does not fail because it is not tea. Each ingredient has to be understood through its own flavor, its own chemistry, and its own history. Carob was denied that chance. It was placed beside chocolate, judged by chocolate's standards, and dismissed by people who had never been taught how Mediterranean cooks actually used it. In traditional kitchens, carob was not always trying to imitate cacao. It could be syrup poured into a drink, flour mixed into dough, roasted powder blended into sweets, or a darkener that brought gentle sweetness without needing as much refined sugar. Its value came from the way it interacted with local food systems, not from its ability to copy a candy bar. This is why the old health food version of carob failed so badly. It asked a dry land pod to perform the role of a tropical bean. It asked a naturally sweet ingredient to imitate the bitterness of cacao. It asked a caffeine-free food to compete with one of the most emotionally powerful stimulant flavors in the world. And when it failed that impossible test, the market treated the plant itself as the problem. But the plant was never the problem. The problem was the story people told about it. That story made carob seem like a disappointing substitute at the same moment its seed was becoming useful to industry. While the pod pulp struggled with an identity crisis, the seed quietly entered food manufacturing as locust bean gum. One part of the tree became technical, invisible, and profitable. The other part became a memory of health food disappointment. This split is what makes carob so unusual. It was not completely forgotten, and it was not fully embraced. It survived in two separate worlds, one industrial and hidden, the other traditional and regional. What disappeared was the bridge between them, the idea that carob could be a serious food ingredient in its own right. And now, that bridge is beginning to matter again, because the world that dismissed carob was built on the assumption that cacao would remain abundant, affordable, and dependable. For decades, that assumption seemed safe enough. Chocolate became cheap everywhere and emotionally untouchable. But a food system built around one beloved crop can become fragile when that crop comes under pressure. And in recent years, cacao has begun showing just how fragile a global obsession can become. For most of the modern world, chocolate has felt permanent. It sits beside supermarket checkouts, fills holiday shelves, appears in birthday cakes, morning cereals, protein bars, ice creams, spreads, and drinks. It is treated less like a crop and more like a universal flavor, something so familiar that people rarely stop to ask where it actually comes from. But chocolate is not universal in the way its presence suggests. It begins with cacao. And cacao is not an easy plant. Cacao grows best in warm, humid regions near the equator, often under conditions very different from the dry landscapes where carob thrives. It requires careful harvesting, fermentation, drying, shipping, roasting, grinding, and blending before it becomes the chocolate flavor people recognize. That complexity is part of what makes chocolate extraordinary. But it is also what makes it vulnerable. A chocolate bar may look simple on a store shelf, but behind it sits a long chain of farmers, weather patterns, plant diseases, transport routes, processors, traders, manufacturers, and global prices. If one part of that chain weakens, the effect can travel far beyond the farm where the cacao was grown. This is exactly what the world began seeing more clearly during the recent cocoa crisis. West Africa, especially Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, supplies a large share of the world's cacao. When bad weather, disease pressure, aging trees, underinvestment, and economic stress collide in that region, the global chocolate market feels it almost immediately. Prices rise, manufacturers reformulate, consumers notice smaller packages or higher costs, and a flavor that once felt endlessly available suddenly looks far more fragile. This does not mean chocolate is disappearing. It means the assumption behind cheap chocolate is weakening. For decades, consumers in wealthy markets became accustomed to cacao being available in almost every form imaginable. Chocolate became so common that its agricultural difficulty disappeared from public view. Few people eating a candy bar thought about tree diseases, rainfall patterns, farm gate prices, or the narrow geography of cacao production. But every crop carries the climate of the place that grows it. Cacao carries the humidity, labor, disease risk, and economic pressure of the tropical belt. Carob carries something else. It carries the logic of dryland agriculture. A mature carob tree can tolerate heat and drought far better than many fruit crops. It belongs to Mediterranean landscapes, where long, dry summers are not unusual, but expected. Once established, it can produce pods with relatively low water demands, making it interesting in regions where the future of agriculture may depend not only on yield, but on resilience. That is why carob becomes more interesting during a cacao crisis, not because it can copy chocolate perfectly, and not because it can replace every use of cacao. It cannot. A dark chocolate bar, built around cocoa butter, cocoa solids, bitterness, and fermentation, is not the same thing as roasted carob powder. But not every chocolate-flavored product needs the full complexity of cacao. Some drinks, baked goods, cereals, spreads, fillings, and dessert bases need something dark, sweet, roasted, and comforting. In those spaces, carob can reduce dependence on cacao or stand as its own ingredient entirely. This is where the idea of infinite chocolate becomes useful, only if we understand it carefully. It does not mean endless chocolate bars growing from a tree without cost or labor. It means a different kind of abundance. A tree that can produce sweet brown pods in dry regions. A crop that does not rely on caffeine or theobromine for its appeal. A food that can be roasted, milled, boiled into syrup, blended into drinks, or combined with cacao to stretch limited supplies. The mistake would be to oversell it again. If carob is presented as a perfect replacement for chocolate, the same failure will repeat. People will taste it, search for cacao, and dismiss it when the match is not exact. But if carob is presented as a dryland sweet pod with its own roasted flavor, the conversation changes. It is no longer a failed imitation. It becomes a parallel ingredient. That difference matters because the future of food may require more parallel ingredients, not fewer. A resilient food system cannot depend entirely on one crop, one region, one flavor standard, or one fragile supply chain. It needs alternatives that do not erase beloved foods, but reduce the pressure placed on them. Carob offers exactly that kind of possibility. It has history behind it, function inside the food industry, nutrition that makes it more than empty sweetness, and an agricultural profile that fits a warming Mediterranean world better than many crops now under stress. But there is still one more part of the story, because knowing that carob has potential is not the same as knowing how it can return. If the plant was misrepresented once, its comeback depends on avoiding the same mistake. It cannot come back as fake chocolate. It has to come back as carob. And that return begins with the simplest question of all. What can this pod actually do? The return of carob will not begin by pretending it is chocolate. That was the old mistake. And if the same mistake is repeated, the result will likely be the same. People will taste carob while expecting cacao. Notice the difference immediately, and decide once again that the plant has failed. But carob does not fail when it is allowed to be itself. Roasted carob powder can bring dark color, natural sweetness, and a gentle toasted flavor to cakes, cookies, breads, and hot drinks. Carob syrup can sweeten desserts and beverages with a depth that belongs more to dried fruit and molasses than to ordinary sugar. Carob flour can blend into breakfast foods, snack bars, and caffeine-free evening drinks for people who want something warm and brown, without the stimulant chemistry of cacao. In some foods, carob can stand alone. In others, It can work beside cacao, reducing the amount of cocoa needed while adding sweetness, fiber, and roasted complexity of its own. This may be one of its most realistic modern roles, not replacing chocolate entirely, but easing the pressure on it. That distinction is important. A resilient food system does not need every alternative crop to destroy the crop before it. It needs ingredients that can share the work. If cacao is expensive, climate-sensitive, and concentrated in vulnerable regions, then even partial substitutes matter. A bread does not need to be made from only one grain. A sweetener does not need to come from only one plant. A chocolate-like flavor world does not need to depend on cacao alone. Carob belongs in that wider imagination. It can become part of baking, drinks, syrups, spreads, and dryland agroforestry systems. It can support farms in regions where water is becoming more precious. It can provide pods for food and seeds for gum. It can remain useful even when the final product is not a chocolate bar at all. But carob also demands patience. A carob tree is not an annual crop that can be planted in spring and harvested by autumn. It takes years to mature, and growers often need to consider pollination, variety, climate, and long-term orchard planning. It thrives best in warm, dry regions, not everywhere. In colder or wetter climates, it may never become practical outside specialized conditions. This is why the phrase infinite chocolate has to be understood carefully. The abundance is real only when the tree is matched to the right place. In the wrong climate, carob is just another struggling crop. In the right landscape, it becomes something very different. A long-lived tree capable of producing pods from dry ground where many sweeter crops would demand far more water and care. That is where its future begins to look less like nostalgia and more like strategy. Across the Mediterranean and other dryland regions, farmers are already being forced to think differently about heat, drought, fire risk, and the cost of irrigation. Crops that once seemed ordinary may become harder to justify if they require too much water. Trees that survive with less attention may become more valuable, not because they are fashionable, but because they fit the land more honestly. Carob fits that question. It does not ask the Mediterranean to behave like the tropics. It does not require a humid cacao belt. It does not need to be shipped across the world before it can become useful in every form, in the regions where it grows well. It offers a local source of sweetness, color, texture, and roasted flavor from a tree already adapted to dry summers. That does not make it a complete answer to the chocolate crisis. No single plant can carry that burden. The cocoa crisis is tied to climate, disease, farm economics, poverty, trade systems, and consumer expectations built over generations. Carob cannot solve all of that, but it can challenge one assumption, that the future of brown, sweet, comforting foods must depend entirely on cacao. That assumption is beginning to look weaker. And the irony is that carob never needed to be discovered from scratch. It was already there. It was in Mediterranean villages where people still remembered syrups and roasted pod powders. It was in animal feed traditions where pods had long been valued as energy-rich food. It was in scientific papers where researchers studied its fiber, minerals, and polyphenols. It was in food factories where its seed quietly became locust bean gum, stabilizing products for consumers who had no idea they were already using part of the tree. Carob did not vanish. It was split into pieces. One piece became a technical ingredient. One piece became a failed health food memory. One piece remained alive in the places that never forgot how to use it. The opportunity now is to put those pieces back together. Not by forcing carob to compete with chocolate on chocolate's terms, but by giving it a more honest identity. It can be roasted carob. It can be carob syrup. It can be a caffeine-free pod drink. It can be a dryland crop. It can be a blending ingredient that helps reduce cacao demand without asking people to abandon the flavor they love. That is a quieter promise than infinite chocolate. But it is also a stronger one, because the future rarely arrives as a perfect replacement for the past. More often, it arrives as a forgotten option that becomes useful again when conditions change. And conditions have changed. Cacao is still extraordinary, but it is no longer invisible. Its fragility is becoming visible in prices, shortages, supply chains, and the pressure placed on farmers who grow it. Chocolate will not disappear, but the world around chocolate is shifting. In that shifting world, carob deserves another look. So the next time someone turns over an ice cream carton and sees locust bean gum printed in small letters near the bottom of the label, it may be worth pausing for a moment. That name is not just an additive. It is the trace of a tree the modern world half remembered and half forgot. A tree whose seed entered the food industry quietly, while its sweet pod waited outside the story. A tree once dismissed because it was introduced as the wrong thing. And perhaps, at the exact moment cacao has become more fragile, that old mistake can finally be corrected. Because what looked like failed chocolate may still become something far more useful, a forgotten food returning under its own name.